We do get a good value for voltage in the back, but the actual current draw from the back isn't quite what I would be expecting. This was about 900 milliamps up front, and it looks like we're getting about 1/10 of the power draw from that port there in the back. Not sure why that is, and that just did a little bit of the same thing that I was doing up front as well. Interesting. We're going to try the other USB here. That's much more like what we're expecting. So you might have two USBs here that are a little problematic. This front USB-C and this top one in the back. Let's go ahead and play with that again. Yeah, I think something's going on with that. I just realized I can't even push that in all the way. So a couple of ports there. Something's a little bit off with them. I am taking a closer look at that port that was giving us some trouble, and now that I'm looking closer at it, for sure, there's a good section here on the left side that's broken. I'm sure you can see that even in the camera. And then the actual connector in the middle is quite loose. So if you want it to be, that can afford to be replaced for sure. Warranty stickers missing on the inside, but we were expecting that. Just taking a look around, kind of the first glimpse here on the inside. This would be our connector here. I can tell that we're just hanging on by a thread maybe. So I'm not gonna pull on that too much so I can get a closer look without the camera in my hand. Okay, so I was thinking that there maybe was still a little bit of a connection in there. I loosened this up with isopropanol and pulled it away. But it looks like that's not the case. Looks like we got a clean break all the way through. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and get that soldered back on. Just assessing our damage here while we're getting a first look. So we're missing some chunks of our motherboard here. Those are probably still attached to the bottom of our connector there. Yep, there they are, those little brown pieces. So we'll work with this. We'll go ahead and rebuild these areas and get the solder back on. Okay, I cleared off the top layer of the section that's damaged here where we're going to solder to. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that this is rigid to the board again, and that it's going to have a harder time coming back up. And then we're going to go ahead and rebuild the electrical connections and get things soldered in. Okay, added a couple of lengths of copper here to extend this load out to the top. We're going to epoxy the rest of that down, cover up an area where we got to make sure is covered for a via that's going through our motherboard, and then we're going to go in and lay down a foundation for our grounding planes and make sure everything can get soldered in correctly too. The bottoms will be smoothed out here in a second. I just need something to anchor down those extensions while the epoxy sets. Okay, I know this area is still a little bit rough, but I just want to come through here and just make sure everything's connected where it needs to be before I spend a lot of time cleaning it up. But what you just heard in the background is continuity. I just want to make sure that everything's going where it needs to. So this pad here to ground. We've got this pad here, going to ground on both sides. Connection here. Okay, good connection there. From this pad to this pad. And this section to this section. Okay, so we'll be able to reattach our fan now. Take our time doing that, but at first I'm going to go and get this cleaned up and get everything filled with an epoxy overcoat. There's a close-up of the actual motherboard. Okay, so we went ahead and cleaned this up a little bit. We reflowed our solder a little bit across the tops of the pads. Now we're just going to anchor everything down with some epoxy, and we'll reattach our connector. Sealing in epoxy. Epoxy is cured here. This should be as hard as the original substrate for the rest of the PCB. So we're going to go and grind this back and go and solder that connector back on. Okay, still need to add one last layer of epoxy here, but this is on there. It's nice and solid. The whole board moves with it, so look at it underneath the microscope, but this looks good. There's our 3 pins in the front. I see a solder fillet forming from here to this pin, a solder fillet forming from here to this pin, and last but not least, a solder fillet forming from there to that pin. So we should be perfectly connected there. We tested earlier to make sure that those pads underneath that we reconstructed are attached to the motherboard and that there's continuity, so this should be good. Side anchor on the left, I can see that there's also a fillet here connecting that outer pin to the ground plane. Same story for this side, but that one looks even clearer. Before we put one last layer of epoxy on here, we're just going to evaluate our connector one last time. You come here to the pad underneath and just touch here, touch that pin, connection there. You notice I'm not touching the pin on the bottom. See where the red probe's at? I'm not touching those pins. I'm touching the solder joint underneath and making sure there's connection. So now we can make sure that these guys aren't electrically soldered to each other. So I can touch this pin and this pin. That looks good. Touch this pin and this pin. And finally touch the outside pins. That's the way it's supposed to be. Okay, and here's our finished connector underneath the microscope. Okay, we're now going to go ahead and take out this piece here and go and replace it with a brand new part. Old USB 3.0 has been removed. Brand new, never before used USB port. We're going to solder this in. New port installed. I'll go in and get this cleaned up and tested. Looking at the sides of our new USB port, we have a nice solder fillet. And looking at the back, I can see the tips of every pin and a nice fillet going up to each of those pins. That's exactly what we want to see. Connections in the middle all look good. This port should be good to go. Alright, before I button up any deeper here, just wanted to turn this on, make sure our fan is spinning, and it is. And the other thing I wanted to check is make sure that we were getting a voltage and a current draw on the USB port that we replaced. And it looks like we certainly do. Next we'll try and pair the controller through it. And then we're going to give the system a moment to boot.